So I just want to say good afternoon to all of you and welcome to this critically important webinar on From Crisis to Care, Rethinking Gender Justice in Food Systems Under Climate Change in Southern Africa. I am Basani Baloyi, Program Co-Director at the Institute for Economic Justice, and I'm really delighted to be facilitating today's session. As a development economist, an activist, and a feminist, I am particularly excited to guide this conversation that sits at the intersection of climate justice, gender equality, and food systems transformation. We gather at a moment that is quite profound and quite urgent. Southern Africa is a climate change hotspot, heating at twice the global rate, with African women from working class and agrarian societies bearing the heaviest burden. When climate shocks disrupt food systems through floods, droughts, and extreme weather, it is these women, already excluded from access to land, water, credit, and markets, who must somehow bridge the gap between what their families need and what they can access. The working paper we'll discuss today, developed by the Institute for Economic Justice, challenges us to move beyond seeing care work as a woman's natural responsibility and instead recognize it as an essential economic and ecological work that sustains our entire food system. A care approach reorients our thinking towards approaches that recognize and support care as both a social and ecological act. That offers us 5 key principles that will be discussed today. I'm not going to go into them. But let me introduce our distinguished speakers. We will first hear the presentation from Andrew Bennie, that's Dr. Andrew Bennie, who is the Senior Researcher in Climate Policy and Food Systems at the IEJ, and also Yasirah Madhi, who is the Junior Climate Policy and Food Systems Researcher at the IEJ, whose research forms the foundation of today's discussion. Following their presentation, we have 2 exceptional respondents, and that is Sonia Phalatse, who is an economist specializing in feminist economics, economic justice, and climate change. She's a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University and brings rigorous academic training with deep practical experience in advancing economic justice for African women. Yes, you do, Sonia. Our second respondent is Louise Naude from WWF South Africa, who also serves as a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Commission. Louise brings a unique perspective bridging environmental conservation, climate policy, and practical implementation, offering insights into how care approaches might be integrated into existing policy frameworks. Together, these speakers represent the interdisciplinary, intersectional thinking that this crisis demands, combining feminist economics, environmental science, climate policy, and grassroots organizing experience. With that foundation, I would like us to begin, and I would invite Andrew and Yasirah to present their background, their research on gender justice and care in Southern African food systems. Thank you. And then afterwards, we'll go back to our guest speakers.
Okay, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we definitely can.
Great, thank you. Okay, hi everyone, and thanks very much for that introduction, Basani. So yeah, Yasirah and I will be sharing the presentation of this paper. It just gives a snapshot of some of the key points and insights of the paper and recommendations. So we do definitely encourage you, and we hope if you haven't already read the paper that this brief input in this discussion stimulates to go and download the paper and read the whole thing. It is intended not just as something to think about, but also as something to stimulate and help guide action and intervention as well. And so it's on the IEJ website, and I think I'm sure we're also going to be sharing the link in the chat. Just also before getting into it, to acknowledge our co-authors on the paper, Jamela Hoveni, Vanessa Farr, and Lupumlo Nkukana. So it was a collective effort. Okay, so just to give a bit of background to the paper. So part of the kind of key rationale of the paper is we working towards a toolkit on thinking about advancing gender justice in food systems in Southern Africa in the context of climate change and climate impacts in the region. And so the paper is part of an effort to support activists by showing the link between care, food systems, and advocacy. And so we started working on the working paper as part of thinking about the issues and and to help structure the content of the toolkit, which is aimed at activists, civil society organizations, including trade unions, farmer organizations, and policymakers to prompt thinking and action around the importance of centering care in climate policy around food systems and for gender justice. And part of that is in the context where care and the care economy, Sonia Phalatse has been doing some great work on this, there's increased initiative to show the centrality of care, and we'll get on to defining it as a critical element of climate adaptation and the just transition. And so part of the efforts of the paper is to also contribute to creating stronger links between those working on care, food systems, and climate justice arenas. And often, sometimes we can work in silos. Our thinking and our work happens at times in somewhat isolated ways, but really to show the centrality of care as a sort of linking mechanisms between work on care and food systems and in the climate justice arenas, and how critical it is in the context of climate emergency. And so we essentially argue in the paper that a care approach to food systems offers a transformative pathway to gender and climate justice in food systems in Southern Africa. And that essentially what that means is that systemic interventions are needed to address unpaid and unsupported care responsibilities that are deepened under climate stress in Southern Africa and which are highly gendered. And that means that essentially care needs to move to the center of policy for food systems. So we're arguing that it's not just something supplementary to food system policy making or to climate adaptation in general, but it should be seen as a core feature and a core logic of organizing adaptation responses in food systems and into climate change more generally. So the paper, I won't dwell long on this slide, but basically the paper provides a theoretical framework through which to think about care. It covers the climate change impacts on paid and unpaid care work in the food system in Southern Africa and what the climate change impacts in Southern Africa are. And then importantly, it suggests 5 key elements that can initially constitute an approach to advancing and strengthening care and the care economy in food systems policymaking in Southern Africa. So to start off with, so what is care? What do we mean by care? So part of our thinking in how we place care in the paper is to situate it conceptually in feminist ecological economics and feminist political ecology. And for the sake of this presentation, I don't want to go too much into those two linked schools of thought, but the important things to draw out from those are, number one, the importance of thinking about development and transformation beyond just kind of market-centered logics and logics of economic growth as the kind of fundamental driving logic to addressing gender inequalities, to addressing food system vulnerabilities, and so on, and rather to center issues of equity, justice, class, and power, and the way that gender runs through all of those. And essentially the with feminist ecological economics and feminist political ecology, both center care in the care economy as critical, not only in terms of gender. And I think what's also important is that they provide a way to think about moving beyond reducing care to that of just a question concerning women, to care in the sense of all human beings require care in order to live. And so does nature require care in order for natural systems to reproduce themselves, especially when we're talking about human relationships to natural systems. But also that we need to think about care in relation to capitalism. And part of it is that to think about how capitalism undermines the conditions that it needs for its own existence. That includes, for example, it needs water in industrial processes, yet at the same time, economic systems pollute water and undermine the waters that is needed in capitalist production systems. Similarly, capitalism also relies on care labor, especially unpaid and underpaid care labor, so that workers, care labor in the household, for example, so that workers can show up for work. And of course, these are highly gendered. But at the same time, these aspects like care are also critical to, in and of themselves, to human functioning, to the reproduction of humans, and to the reproduction of nature. And so something like care is an important aspect in and of itself to focus on strengthening when we're talking about environmental sustainability and resistance, gender justice, and social justice. So if we were to summarize broadly, care essentially refers to the paid and unpaid work of caregiving that sustains life. So looking after children, looking after the elderly and the sick, feeding members of households, links to food system, is care work. At the same time, healthcare, nursing in both public and private healthcare is paid care work. Unpaid care work is largely concentrated in the household. But secondly, care is also about the social relations through which care occurs. So the gendered relations, for example, who predominantly undertakes care work? What are the conditions of those care work? But also social relations in the sense that care isn't just about reproducing physical bodies, they're also about reproducing society and social connections between humans, and the quality of the social connections. And then, of course, thirdly, care is also an ethic toward people and nature that can guide behavior, guide policy, including economic policy, and so on. What's important, we put there what's called the care diamond, and the importance of the takeaway point from the care diamond is that how care takes place in any particular context, if we call it a country context or regional context, is shaped by history. So if, for example, healthcare primarily is either undertaken by families and households, or one relies on the market, for example, through private healthcare in a particular country, for example, or in a particular class context in a country, that's shaped by a particular history of that country. If healthcare is primarily provided by the state, for example, that also is very often a consequence of particular social struggles to win those gains, for example. And so how care is distributed, we'll come back to it, is a really critical question in terms of gender justice. So two things there. It's about how care is distributed between institutions. Do people primarily have to rely to pay on the market for care, or is it provided by the public sector, or is it provided through mutual aid, self-organization, communities, or a combination? And secondly, how is care distributed between genders? The next thing we do in the paper is to connect care then to the food system. So very briefly, the food system is about the production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food, but also the food system is about its outcomes. So is a food system in any particular context, is it realizing the right to food? Is an important part of what a food system is. What are the socioeconomic outcomes of the food system? So what are the patterns of hunger and insecurity? What are the patterns of the conditions of work, of workers in the food system? It also has environmental and socioeconomic drivers. So how a food system looks It's grounded in particular environments, but also has very particular impacts on the environment. And crucial in shaping how a food system looks in any context is power. So if food system primarily represents the interests of large-scale commercial agribusiness, for example, versus African working class women, that's also a question of power in terms of who has the most power to shape the food system and represent their interests. And so I think just from this side, it's the couple of takeaway points to note are that thinking about the relationship then between care and the food system is care is core to the provision to feeding people, for example. So the care work in the household to cook food, to procure that food, and to feed people in the household is care work. Very often the act of growing food, for example, among smallholder farmers who grow for local markets or directly for the household, that's also care work, producing food to feed the household. It's also care work that, and part of our argument in the paper is that care work is also about ecological relations. And so how we produce food is a question of care in terms of it's how we relate to soil, to other species, to biodiversity, to seeds, and so on. And so, yeah, in that sense, care labor also is critical to maintaining certain ecological conditions. But also at the level of policy, care-related policies shape food systems and outcomes. So health policy is a critical link to nutrition, for example. What kind of diets are promoted by public health authorities, but also the quality of healthcare. At the same time, what people consume in food systems, for example, the industrial food system provides cheap but unnutritious and highly processed food at a mass scale that very often is, in context of poverty, is what most poor households can afford. High consumption of those sorts of foods has very significant health impacts, again, relating very closely to the care economy. But also examples from different parts of the world, like Belo Horizonte in Brazil, shows us how institutions and policies centered on care, like people's restaurants, like subsidized food markets to make highly nutritious food available close to communities at affordable prices. Those are all policies informed by an ethic of care, but they're also strongly linked to institutions and public social infrastructures of care. Is crucial to shaping how a food and organizing a food system and what the outcomes of that food system are. Okay, so at that point, I will hand over to Yasirah to take us through then thinking more about what are the climate change impacts in Southern Africa, and especially in gender terms, that call for us to think about a care approach as the climate adaptation and gender justice approach in food systems.
Thanks, Andrew. To look at how we draw the link between how Southern Africa and an increasing gender burden of care is worse than under a changing climate in the food systems, we broke it down and looked at a few things. So firstly, we looked at just the fact that climate change in Southern Africa is a climate change hotspot, with warming expected to double the global average, as Basani mentioned in her introduction, and there's severe weather impacts for the production level in Southern Africa. Sorry, people are saying the sound is bad. Is that the case for everyone, or can people hear me?
I think
it's sort of fuzzy. So it's almost as if your microphone is being disturbed. Yeah, it's because you've got it in your ears and instead of using your laptop microphone.
Okay, sure. Is that better?
Much.
If I'm disconnected.
We can hear you, Yasirah.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. So yeah, I was saying that, we broke down what the impacts are. So we look firstly at how climate change and food systems in Southern Africa occurs, and that Southern Africa is a climate change hotspot that has severe weather impacts, including floods and droughts. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so I hope that's better. But yeah, just that climate change in Southern Africa, the climate is a hotspot, and there's many weather impacts like floods and droughts, and that many of that agriculture in Southern Africa is mainly rain-fed in most countries except for South Africa. So that the climate impacts will be severely felt in the food system, especially on the production level, but then having knock-on effects. And then there's the second aspect is then to understand the historical and structural context that has led to the care work distribution that we see in Southern Africa, Southern Africans' food systems today, which is deeply gendered and largely falls upon women. So this is mainly molded by post-colonial state-led development, deepened commodification, and a subordination of agriculture to industrialization. And so how that looks is that cash crops are prioritized, cash crops for export are prioritized, and smallholder agriculture is subordinated. And this then created a push factor leading to labor migration, where people, specifically men, moved away from household agriculture towards earning wages. And this left Black rural women in rural areas to deal with an increased unpaid care burden. And this means that there's an increase, because there's now this phenomenon led to an increased dependence on markets and a failure to provide full incorporation for them into formal, for people into formal wage labor. It created fragmented, multiple and informal livelihoods. Because wage labor was insufficient, Southern African economies then retained prevalent agrarian structures where agriculture and natural resources remain critical sources of livelihood for working people's households, and therefore a gendered labor underpins this multiple livelihood structure. And then lastly, this commodification meant the industrialization of food systems, where production was framed as needed to meet nutritional outcomes. And so production needed to be increased, and this introduced things like artificial fertilizers and GMOs and greater private control of the system. And this leads to a market-centered approach where solutions to gender inequality then focused on raising women farmers' productivity through provision of private sector inputs rather than looking at structural changes that could be made. And so this led to then the gender dimensions of climate change and food systems in Southern Africa that we see today, intensifying women's unpaid care work, especially in rural and working class communities, which meant more time collecting water and fuel, more time spent farming for food, women taking on more of the subsistence farming, but then also being forced to find work off farms. Women also have unequal access to land and agricultural inputs, and the focus has not been on these structural inequalities, but rather on individual empowerment through microloans and entrepreneurship training, which fails to solve then the larger issues and can often create greater debt for women. Then in addition, climate change is linked to increasing food prices, mainly affecting women who are disproportionately responsible for food provisioning and often absorb the cost of food scarcity through nutritional sacrifice, and low-income households shift to cheaper, ultra-processed food, creating a gendered nutrition crisis. There's also health outcomes, so there's more disease outbreak under climate, and women are more susceptible, but also they shoulder more of the responsibility of looking after the ill. And then climate also causes GBV can increase as livelihoods collapse. Women can become more economically dependent on men, on male partners, creating higher economic vulnerability, and resource scarcity and displacement expose women to new forms of violence. So yeah, based on all of this, we see that policy in South Africa does not adequately, in Southern Africa, does not adequately address these dimensions in an integrated and intersectional manner. And this is because in the region, dominant agricultural frameworks reinforce industrial input-driven models that marginalize women and sideline local knowledge systems. And we can see key examples in many outputs like the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program developed by the African Union Commission, or in AGRA, which is the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which all promote industrialized models of agriculture, synthetic fertilizers, or high-yield seeds. And so these initiatives tend to have a market-centric empowerment narrative, and equate women's empowerment with market participation. And so then ignoring the unpaid labor, land access, and the intensification of care work under climate stress. And this means that these policies continue to promote an underinvestment in care infrastructure and fail to adequately address vulnerabilities of climate, meaning there was an overall neglect of the care climate nexus. And so this paper then focuses on these deficiencies in policy and asks how gender can be achieved through addressing the underlying structures and relations that shape the burden, distribution, and recognition of care work. And we presented 5 key areas of intervention to serve as an initial guideline for strengthening and supporting care in Southern African food systems. So the first is to recognize, reward, and represent care work. So recognize is to make visible and value the contributions of unpaid care work in agriculture and the food systems through food provisioning, preparation, as well as the contribution to climate resilience. And so recognition also means including this in policy, legislation, and provide tangible support. And reward means supporting community-based care work, care initiatives such as food kitchens by ensuring they are sustainably funded and provide decent work for women. And representation just means that care workers are heard and understood through meaningful participation. The second thing there is then reducing and redistributing the amount of care work. Reduction means making care tasks more convenient and less physically demanding, for example, through affordable energy that eases the burden of cooking. And then redistribution means redistributing a greater share of care work, such as between genders or in households and communities, or between which means extra straight provisioning and social infrastructure to support that. Thirdly is to ensure stronger policy, practical, and financial support for agriculture, guided by the higher level panels of experts, 13 principles, which you can see more of in the paper. But agroecology is essentially a regenerative approach to food that protects nature and embodies a deep ethic of care, valuing both ecological health and social equity through principles like biodiversity, fairness, and participation. And it therefore advances practical practices and logics that resist capitalism's tendency to fragment and undermine care, labor, and social connections. The fourth one is then participation. So top-down approaches in policymaking, research, and program development tend to reproduce existing power relations, including those around gender. So enhanced local control, women's agency, and the right to participate is critical for political processes to achieve gender justice and support care work. And this participation must go beyond tokenism and ensure meaningful participation of food systems, care labors in climate policy process, and ensure local control and agency. And it must ensure that participation in the food systems is from an angle of care, and ultimately acknowledge that participation is not enough, but there needs to be material shifts in resources and power that is needed. And then the last key principle is the link to fiscal policy, linking fiscal policy to care in the food systems. So fiscal policy must underwrite care by directing funds to social infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, childcare, and elder care. And then also, because budgets are never neutral, tools like gender disaggregated data can reveal where care is undervalued and services underfunded. And integrating things like gender responsive and climate responsive budgeting then allows government to act on these insights, targeting resources where climate and gender inequalities intersect. And there needs to be a pushback also against austerity measures and more investment in care services, livelihoods, and food price regulations. So in conclusion, a care approach to food systems offers a transformative pathway for gender and climate justice by grounding policy and practices in ethics of care. And under climate stress, unpaid and underpaid care responsibilities deepen, making systemic interventions essential. So centering care in policy will provide both a practical and a political agenda, one that strengthens and supports care work, redistributes the burden more fairly, and ensures that food system serves people and the planet rather than just narrow economic goals. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, both of you, for that insightful presentation. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that, it prompts a couple of questions. Oh, sorry, I've just been alerted to the fact that you cannot see me, but you can hear me. Sorry about that. Yes, I was just saying that your presentation prompts a couple of questions for me around, what does gender justice mean for climate action and food systems? What steps can be taken to ensure that the care approach is actually integrated into policy frameworks? And how do we engage carers as co-producers of policy rather than just simple beneficiaries, if they are that even? Since what we learn is that they're quite excluded from policy and practice. But so where I am now going to turn is to ask our first respondent, and I believe that is you, Sonia, to respond and just give us some reflections about your thoughts and where we should go.
Hi everyone. It's good to see everyone on this call, and I'm really grateful to have been invited to this panel. I really enjoyed this paper, so well done to the climate team for putting this together. I thought it was really informative and a very timely input into pressing questions that I think a lot of us as activists, climate and gender activists, have also been trying to think through. And so I thought the paper was really thorough and really well written. So thank you for that offering. While I was reflecting on the paper this week, I was also reading a paper by a feminist artist and writer whose name is Joanna Hevda. And I wanted to share a quote from this paper that I think in many ways reflects the conversation that's already been happening and the working paper itself. And she says, "The most anti-capitalist protest is to care for another and to care for yourself, to take on the historically feminized and therefore invisible practice of nursing, nurturing, caring, to take seriously each other's vulnerability and fragility and precarity and to support it, honor it, empower it, to protect each other to enact and practice community, a radical kinship, an interdependent sociality, a politics of care. Close quote. And excuse me, my throat is really scratchy today. So I'll be like clearing my throat a lot. But I think that this quote is essentially what we should be calling for as activists and people wanting to change the status quo, is an ethic and politics of care that makes visible the many ways that capitalism survives by exploiting care and labor and care labor, and that the unpaid and underpaid work of women is what sustains our environment, our communities, our hosts and our households, and culture and the labor force itself. And this working paper, I think, does a great job of kind of describing in detail how care work is systematically devalued and treated as an inexhaustible resource. And also how climate change deepens this contradiction. As Yasirah was talking, we know that droughts and floods and crop failures intensify because of climate change. This has kind of direct impacts on women's care burden. Women tend to, well, that's what the research shows, that women tend to work longer hours to collect water, to secure food, to hold communities together when both the state and public infrastructure collapses. And so the work that I am currently doing as a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, we are doing research around what we call the care climate nexus, which originally the aim was to show how capitalism not only exploits wage labor, it also exploits the earth. So the ways that it exploits the earth is very similar to the way that it exploits women's unpaid labor, but also in many ways offloads that cost or the costs of ecological and social production onto women and other kind of marginalized communities. And as your paper shows, that this is not an accident, but is in many ways a structural necessity of capitalist accumulation, and that food systems that are driven mostly by big agribusiness and private financiers and global markets generate profits precisely by externalizing their costs, by exhausting natural resources, and by relying on women to absorb kind of the fallout from this. And so in this way, climate change is not just an environmental cost, but is also a reflection of a crisis of care, crisis of social of reproduction. The working paper also points to, I think, the other side of this contradiction, which is that women's ecological knowledge and practices such as seed saving, agroecology, food sharing are all kind of forms of collective reproductive labor, and that these strategies of survival and care are in many important ways also a form of resistance, and in that they challenge the commodification of what we know as the most basic human right, the right to food, and that these networks of care demonstrate alternative ways of organizing production around life instead of profit. And here I think, as Andrew was also talking about, the contribution of feminist political ecologists is very important, and in the ways that they refuse this false separation between the economy and ecology, and between public and private. But what I'm most interested in, I think, and what this working paper, which is important contribution, I think, to understanding of food systems. I think I'm most interested in what does it really mean for climate policy. Well, I think it means many things, but I think that it demonstrates, well, firstly, it demonstrates that climate policy is one of the main terrains where the struggle over reproduction is currently playing out and will play out even more strongly in the future, which honestly, I don't think that climate scientists and policymakers fully grasp or not even close to understanding, based on my experience in trying to relay all this information about care and caring for the environment and caring for each other. A lot of it is very new to them. And as we know, at present, most climate policies reveal very much a lack of imagination. You know, they are very market driven and technocratic. There's a lot about carbon markets and so-called climate smart agriculture and a lot of private sector led adaptation programs and schemes that research actually does show deepens control over land and food to the hands of a few, and continues to invisibilize unpaid care work that includes caring for the environment and caring for nature, in addition to caring for each other. And I think that this is the important work that we as activists will need to take forward, is that we will need very strongly to demand that economic and climate policy acknowledges care and care infrastructure as not as an afterthought, but as central, as crucial to climate adaptation. And that we have no other option but to demand a redistribution of resources, of land, of decision-making power. And of course, also climate finance is important, that climate flows not only to corporations, but to public systems and communities and community-led initiatives that sustain life and well-being. And importantly, we must insist that care is collectivized and socialized and materially supported. And I think someone in the comments was talking about affective care. And I think that's also what I'm kind of alluding to, that at the end of the day, yes, care has an active, affective aspect to it, in that it is emotional, but it is work at the end of the day, and work is work, and it needs to be socialized and materially supported. And so in closing, I think that this type of working paper and literature is important for us as activists to understand and engage with, yes, but it's very, very important that we take this to where the decisions are actually made. And I think importantly, we make climate scientists and policymakers understand and take it forward too. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sonia. And I really thoroughly enjoyed much of what you've said, beginning with the quote that around how the ethics of care, caring for self and caring for others, is an unapologetically anti-capitalist form of existence. And it's a political expression, it's ideological, it's spiritual, as well as an economic practice that we should all live by. And also just talking to us about how the strategies of survival and the various networks of care that are built demonstrate a form of disruption to this current system, and also opens us up to various alternatives that are there before us to exploit. And sorry for using that capitalist term. And sharing how they are disruptors against false dichotomies between the separation of economy, ecology, public, and private. And then hitting it home by sharing about how the climate policy actually demonstrates a lack of imagination, and how it is actually the main terrain through which the politics and contestations around reproduction is now being fought. With that, you closed us off by saying, let's take it where? Let's take it to the decision makers. I'm now bringing it to our commissioner. Louise Naude, did you see what I did there?
Yeah, I saw that.
I didn't know she was going to do that.
Sneaky. Let's take it to you, Louise.
If only I had the power and control that is being ascribed to me. Okay. So let me talk about some ideas. So I've been out in the space. Look, firstly, the aspect of gender justice in the just transition is very underdeveloped in this country. If you look at some of the documents that have been produced by Life After Coal campaign, by the Climate Justice Charter, and products of labor, there is some attention to gender, but in the Commission's own Just Transition framework, there is sort of one or two references to woman, but not really a cohesive approach to gender justice in a just transition. So, the strongest thing that's out there is COSATU's blueprint for a just transition for workers, which does a very great job of gender and analysis particularly in the three sectors that the blueprint focuses on, being energy, transport, and agriculture. And I think that IEJ had a big hand in that as well. But so, firstly, gender is a gap in our thinking and our initiatives. And I've been trying to think, so what is the gender agenda in just transition? And I've been saying, well, the way in which climate change will pitch up in women's lives is, and I understand gender is not reducible to women, but it's through the climate change impacts on food, water, and people have been telling me I should add health to that. So, I think we all hear that. And then in terms of the low carbon transition, it's the energy, women's access to enough and affordable energy, and also gender parity in new jobs that might emerge out of the transition. So those are kind of the areas where I've been thinking, women could mobilize around, and all activists could mobilize around a gender agenda. So I really want to say that I'm really thrilled with this paper, because it speaks into that gap. And also, the other excellent job it does is that we almost don't know how to think about both the adaptation and resilience side of a climate change transition and the low carbon side in terms of social relations. It really is a technicist conversation. And the paper underlines that, but goes beyond underlining it. It actually makes an intervention into that and refocuses us on social relations. So thank you very much for that. I found the paper to be well considered and well argued, erudite, and a delight to read. And it stimulated new thinking for me and provided a lot of food for thought. And one of the things that was interesting to me that I'm accustomed to think about care work as reproductive labor. But the paper connects that to care as a value or as an ethic, as it came through in the presentation. And I initially thought, oh, you're losing focus here, you're throwing everything in this basket of the word care. But I think that it's actually a strength of the paper that you are approaching this concept in that holistic manner. So thank you for that. Okay, so, my interest is to think about the spectrum from analysis through developing a collective agenda and program for gender justice in the transition, finding the platforms and campaigns, some of which might be government-facing demands, but I don't think it's limited to that. That ultimately lead towards a program for systemic change. Systemic change in neoliberal capitalism and its manifestations in the state and in patriarchy. And so it is very exciting to see in the paper, and Andrew also repeated it, that you are planning a toolkit, because I think that's, it's sort of a weapon in this journey from analysis to actual systemic change. And so thank you for that. The one thing that I was thinking about a lot, and the paper helped crystallize this for me, is that the way food gets to us and what kind of food and whether we can afford it or not is not a question of how much we could produce on the land. So a lot of this climate change literature is about the impacts on production, whether smallholder farmers or, industrial farming. But, the decisions made as to what food and how to price it are market-based and have nothing to do really. So almost climate change is almost a bit irrelevant. Yeah, that's the point of intervention if we want everyone to be able to have nutritious and sufficient food. And in that light, I would just like to dip my cap to Professor Jackie Koch, who is an eco-socialist feminist, who way back in 2011 wrote a section in a COSATU booklet on food. And, she precisely examined this question of, the affordability of food and what drives that. And the paper, the IEJ paper also, it looks at the situation of the crop failures in Zambia and Zimbabwe. And those were a product of climate change, biophysical impacts on the land and on the crops. But then in South Africa, we start exporting our maize to those two countries because that's a lucrative market to go to, which meant that there was less maize in the country and the prices went up. So that's, the paper makes a good example of this issue that I'm raising. And I just want to tell you all that WWF is looking to embark on a project where we take a basket, or, a theoretical basket of nutritious basic foods and see how those could be produced in a nature positive way. And I really would hope and wish that some of the issues raised in this paper, find their way into that work. We tend to be a bit, we're not very agenda aware in WWF. Okay. Then I want to turn now to this issue of recognize, reward, and represent that the paper raises. And just a question popped up for me, and I don't have any ideas about it, but I was wondering whether the sort of economics on externalities might speak into this question of reward, reward of unpaid or even lowly paid care work, because it's a cost that society and businesses are externalizing upon women and our time and our bodies. So I wonder if there's something there that would bear further exploration. Although, that externalities literature is about putting a price on things, and maybe you don't want to. Although there were some feminists long ago who said, okay, I want to, we must campaign for our housework to be paid for. Okay, shifting to the reduce and redistribute part of this. So in terms of reduce, the paper speaks about food kitchens, seed banks maintained by women farmers, childcare and so on. And I was thinking, perhaps we can extend that kind of cooperative model to other things like communal laundries, where a certain number of people can earn a livelihood of doing the washing, and then not every, the woman in every single household doesn't have to do her own washing, and somebody earns a living off it. And things like libraries, of tools that we can borrow, like farming tools, that one doesn't have to afford each smallholder farmer having their own stuff, but there could be a library of sorts where one borrows it. Yeah, and state support for such things. And then on the redistribute element, your paper is sophisticated, and it's not just looking at redistributing the workload in households, but that is an aspect of it. And I think that we made a mistake when we campaigned for affirmative action in relation to women's entry into the world of work, that equal pay for equal work, and more women getting the jobs, often jobs historically dominated by men. And we never thought about men's entry into the spheres of care work that mainly women take responsibility for. And we need some kind of intervention into that. I mean, yeah. And that, I don't know how to do that. The only way I think about it is that individual women in their households have to struggle for that. And that can't be, the way to create systemic change, but it might be a component. And then finally, I want to speak about the question of participation. The paper says, this is a matter of class and political organization. And so, what is, and that people in the food system at grassroots level should be co-designers of policy, not just included as consultees. And so for me, the question arises then of what are the modalities for this, and sustained modalities, not just pop up, get consulted when a policy is being developed, but forums and ways of having sustained contributions from the grassroots involved in care work. And so, firstly, the Rural Women's Assembly, I think, is probably a most magnificent example. And how do we, support, build, and link with that and build out a movement from there, is one example I thought of. And then two sort of examples from what the Presidential Climate Commission is doing. We have something called I've forgotten what it's called. It's called Young Leaders something. And it's a sustained forum where the commission listens to the voices of young people and engages in dialogue and tests our thinking against theirs. So, that's how do we create those? Perhaps we need to go back into our ward committees and, capture those. Yeah. And then there is talk of a permanent gender advisory group being established under the commission. We had a sort of 3 or 4 meetings of such a group in our process of developing our NDC recommendations. And then I must tell you, so I've got 2 more points, Basani. I'm suddenly in a WhatsApp group called Beijing Plus 30. Okay, so Beijing Plus 30 it's 30 years after the 4th World Conference on Women in 1995 in Beijing. And the other people on the WhatsApp group seem to me to be people from the past and current women's movement. And I've asked this group, so what is the group about? Are you building a movement, or are we just planning an event, or what's going on? And somebody said it might develop into movement building. So, maybe that's an exciting space to watch, and I'll keep you all looped in. And then the last thing is to speak about the Commission is developing a just adaptation and resilience investment plan. So this is a sort of akin to the just energy transition investment and then later implementation plan. We're trying to develop a similar thing for the adaptation and resilience realm, which is very difficult. I mean, how long is a piece of string in adaptation and resilience? But I think this might be a moment to decisively interject what we want money for with amounts, because the just energy transition investment plan is that then what got touted to developed countries as fund this. So yeah, I think that's a great opportunity, and I can imagine that IEJ and those who work with you could really lean into that. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Louise, for those excellent contributions. Provoking us to think about, as you say, adaptation and resilience in terms of social relations, which is something that we don't really think about. And you are basically echoing the sentiment of the paper. And then, speaking to the fact that we need to move from how do we take this work and move from analysis to building programs, platforms, and campaigns that hopefully within a neoliberal system can actually support the transformative change. And I really enjoyed listening to how you further developed these principles, around recognize, reward, and represent, because really those are the ones that frame, right, how we can take the toolkit as a form of a weapon. So in your expansive contribution, that helped. And I hope that Andrew and Yasirah could actually take account of some of the things that you mentioned around the economics of externalities and the implications of the care burden. Your thinking beyond when we talk about reduce and redistribute, extending it, right, to other forms of care activities or other forms of social reproduction, whether it be libraries of tools we can borrow, right? I was listening very carefully, so don't think I was sleeping.
You're never sleeping, Basani.
I'm not sleeping. And then also in terms of the modalities, something that we need to think about when you talked about redistribution, how affirmative action almost missed the boat in not thinking about what happens when men move into care work. Actually, a lot of what has been recorded historically is that when they do, then you see the pay goes up, right? When you think about who were the doctors of history, the midwives, then we had medical professionals. I mean, you know, this is a long contestation. And then taking us towards how do we conceive of participation modalities that are actually substantive and not procedural in nature. And then taking it back home to talk about how this intervention can actually be leveraged to support other policy work that is currently going on. The just adaptation and investment plan. Yeah, so that's something that we need to keep a watch of. So yes, so thank you all of you for that. I hope I captured some of the main points that then will help to provoke further discussions. And so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to go into the comment section where I will read out some of the comments. We have a comment from Percy Makubela, who says, and anyone can take this, during Mao's reign in China about 48 years ago, Chinese farmers had problems with their crops being eaten by birds, and the Chinese government didn't know how to solve that issue. Needless to say, there were food shortages. Would you say Southern Africa is facing food shortages caused by not only the climate, but man-made problems like pesticides, which poison crops in farms? Then there is one by Richard Worthington, who says there is an initiative to convene the Agenda Advisory Panel or such like to provide input to the PCC going forward. Is that moving or waiting on the next 5-year cycle of commissioners? And yeah, let's just leave it there and then I'll take the next round. Any of our speakers? Andrew, Yasirah, to answer Percy? And then I think you should respond to Richard, Louise.
Maybe just very briefly on Percy's question. I mean, generally, pesticides, at least in the industrial model of agriculture, pesticides and fertilizers and so on are seen to increase productivity, but the longer term trend is decreased productivity as soils become kind of overused and drenched with chemicals and so on. And as we know, pesticides and artificial fertilizers generally undermine ecological strength and health. So that undermines the future important basis of continued food production. So I think the bigger question is how still it's direct climate impacts that are one of the biggest threats, at least just at the level of food production, one of the biggest threats. And I think that's why building adaptation in food production is important, and also that we think about that adaptation beyond just industrial agriculture and more ecological interventions, but also that's speaking to adaptation, which, as the whole paper has mentioned, as Sonia and Louise's inputs have been speaking to, we need to think about adaptation as more than just about at the level of production, not just a technicist issue, but also gender justice is critical to adaptation. Social relations are critical to adaptation. So that's just my brief response. But yeah, I'm not sure if we'll see if there's more, if people want to raise questions verbally as well.
Indeed, if they do want to raise, I think they can just show their hands and we'll take those comments. But go ahead.
So in response to Richard's question, so we set up, I think we had 3 meetings, or was it 4? I'm not sure. We did have a gender advisory group to try and get inputs for, as we were developing our recommendations on the nationally determined contribution. which is a climate commitment that South Africa has to submit, or all countries have to submit to the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations. And, you know, noting the gap around gender in the work of the Commission, we have thought to extend that and make it almost a standing forum. But we still have to discuss that, and we probably will discuss it informally on Friday, Richard, with the executive director and the deputy chair. And one of the issues that arose, so when it was a gender advisory committee for the purpose of the NDC, we really brought more in gender analysts and experts than gender activists more broadly. So, you know, if we continue it, we would want to expand it, and so that we get the voices of, you know, grassroots organizations in there as well, and not just people working theoretically. But well, theoretically is not the right word to use there, but anyway, there were a couple of the participants who did raise the question of, actually that's how they make their living, you know, is by doing gender work as an expert, and now we're asking them to give it away for free. So, you know, in respect of their time and their expertise, we do also have to address that question.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna actually I'm getting tired at the sound of my own voice. So I'm actually gonna draw people into the conversation if you don't mind. Clement Moepuli has a comment in the chat. Wonder if they can just come in here and just give a brief synopsis of what you're saying. This is about Famine Action Mechanism. Clement? Is Clement there? Okay, I see Clement has disappeared. In fact, a lot of the comments. Are there any other people who would like to raise their hand? Sorry.
Okay. Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, we can
speaking.
hear
Am I
you
audible?
perfectly, Clement. Yes, please.
Oh, Clement. Oh, sorry for that. I'm Clement Moepuli from the Grassroots for Climate Action in Gauteng. It's called. When I'm speaking about the famine, I just want to be straight on the point. When I'm speaking about the famine action mechanism, it's a global partnership which is dedicated to scaling up anticipatedly and anticipatory and early action to protect lives and livelihoods for crisis. Because we're speaking about climate change. We have crisis to climate change. FEM was launched in 2018 by the international community that food security crisis warnings must be often be realized before they happen. We have to have the early warnings, because we have got the early warnings for weather, but we have to have the early warnings for food security, because sometimes due to weather patterns, other places we can't get maize enough, we can't get wheat enough. Now we have to have the global collaboration of knowing and having those security measures. And also the financing and resources have to be in place for that, because these are uncertainties, things that are concerned in the climate change. They are uncertain, because we have now to export something overseas. We're no longer exporting it, we're importing it now. Now it's a challenge also economically for our country. Also, on the firm approach, there's an anticipatory and early actions. which are taken before the major impacts of a crisis fully materialized, where a crisis response action in all the provinces and national have to have elaborate the anticipatory action, refer to action taken in anticipatory
Clement.
crisis.
Sorry, Clement.
Yes.
I'm really sorry to interject. But like we've got a lot of your comment on the text, and you're really doing a very good summary. But I think I just want to pause so I can allow for the speakers to basically respond to what you're saying, which is basically around early warning systems and how they are integrated as part of like an adaptation tool.
Yes, and to mitigate, yes, it's
So
in line with.
But then actually your comment goes beyond that to talk about.
I can hear you.
Talks about like indigenous knowledge and how food was stored and the like.
Yes. Also, we as Africans, we know how to.
Clement, I'm closing the.
Hello.
I'm closing your input for now, just so that we can get other comments in.
No problem.
Okay,
I can just hear you, next. Okay.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Are there any other?
Basani, we seem to have lost you.
No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying, is there anyone who'd like to respond to Clement's proposition?
I mean, perhaps in short, just to say, I mean, anticipatory action, early warning systems is critical, and a critical part of adaptation as well, and intensifying climate impacts. And so, definitely, there's various levels of intervention needed for adaptation. I think, the overarching goal still needs to be reducing emissions at the global level, and obviously that brings in who's responsible and where those mostly need to happen, so that we reduce the intensity of climate impacts as much as possible going into the future. But early warning systems are crucial. Again, those early warning systems also need to be highly gender sensitive and gender just, and again relate to kind of how emergency responses are also undertaken, but also recovery from emergency responses linked to early warning systems is also a critical aspect of gender justice. I think on the issue of indigenous knowledge systems, again, those are also crucial to sustainable food systems, to resilient food systems, and to just food systems, and relates again to the question of participation and recognition as well, and organization to advance those sorts of food systems. So just to agree very briefly on the importance of indigenous food systems, indigenous crops, and indigenous knowledge, that's critical to a just transition, is around procedural justice, participatory justice, and whose knowledge actually shapes decisions.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I have a question of myself, which is really triggered by what Louise pointed out, how we move from analysis to program to campaigns. And I know that this work was workshopped with some activists in Southern Africa, and as a way of thinking about or imagining how we can frame it around like this empowering tool that can help to mainstream, sorry to use that word, this nexus into policy making, right? And support their advocacy. Do you have any reflections around like some of those early discussions around framing for such, like the kinds of, the kinds, like how this can actually be used as a tool? I know you're not there yet, but it would be interesting just to have a few takes on that, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think I was also one of my reflections on Sonia's inputs were, I mean, I thought her point was really important about taking a care approach into climate policy making, and not just with climate policymakers, but I'm interested that Sonia added climate scientists as well, that it impacts how we think about and interpret, produce not climate science, but also how we use and interpret the climate science. So that's one level in terms of the climate science that's informing policy, is disaggregating that science in terms of gendered impacts, for example. I think we're still working on elaborating, and we're also doing other work linked to the toolkit, but also around, for example, taking forward a grassroots and civil society participation agenda in the implementation of the Climate Change Act, various aspects of it, and the National Adaptation Plan, and so on. And key parts of those discussions are also that we need to advance a care approach and agenda justice modalities in the implementation of the Climate Change Act as well. I think some of the key things that relates to is number one, the role, it links also to Louise's point about issues around like kind of tool libraries, communal laundries, and so on, which I think relates to the issue that part of arguing for a care approach is to argue that care approach is not only about the food system per se, it's also about, care institutions like public health care and so on. Labor in other areas, not necessarily directly related in the food system, have very close impact on food system outcomes. And so seeing interconnected parts like around strengthening local public health care, strengthening nutritional content of food related to health and so on, are also important gender just interventions for climate policy. But at the same time, also, for example, measures to stabilize food prices, given the gendered burden of labor, affected labor as well, as one of the comments in the chat mentioned, the way that increases that burden of care work and effective work in terms of feeding families, the gendered burden of feeding families in the context of rising food prices and so on. It is also important to think how to see that as a gendered intervention in climate policy as well. I could go on with a few more, but I don't know, Yasirah, if there's anything you want to add or.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, you've covered it in terms of how it intersects with some of the other work that we're trying to do, but also that the toolkit will come into making these things more practical, not only within South Africa, but if there's like a regional approach to how these tools can be used and be popularized, not only like nationally, but wider. And so I think we've been working with a reference group to develop this working paper, and we're working with another cohort to develop the toolkit to collectively, discuss some of these things of what are the practical tools that we can use to actually move this thing towards something that is more practical. How can we make it a movement or campaign that's mainstreamed into people's daily conversations about climate care and food systems? So yeah.
I think just also to add one quick thing, I mean, as the paper goes into, it's also a critical thing to get into climate policy, the issue of redistributing care labor, recognizing care labor and rewarding care labor. And that's also an important aspect to translating that into climate policy. Okay,
we are actually almost over with this webinar, but I do want to sneak in a comment from Paula Nip. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Paula, would you like to just raise your comment quickly? If you could come in, be so brave.
Hi,
Otherwise, yes, perfectly.
thanks so much, Dr. Baloyi. Yeah, so it might be easier to just say it. I thought since I do have you both here on the call, I would just take advantage of the opportunity. And I just wanted to state that I think the issue still seems to be that there is just not a sort of gender agenda at the highest level. And so I know, Louise, you are obviously involved within the presidency, and I wanted to know because it's actually one of the suggestions I make in my research, and I thought it would be interesting to hear if that's a discussion also happening at the national levels. But Dr. Baloyi, I know you also mentioned this in your keynote address, the G20 recently. Is there conversations happening within government itself for a push for a national care policy, or is that something we're just sort of all talking around at the moment? And even looking at food specifically, are there any conversations around a sort of national gender, food and nutrition security plan, or anything of the sort? I just thought it would be worth asking. I know there's been a recent announcement of a promotion of women's rights, empowerment and gender equality bill. For the second time. I know a couple of years ago there was supposed to be an act that I think missed the window to be tabled at Parliament, and so it just never happened. But yeah, I just thought it would be great to get your insights on the conversations happening at that level. Thank you so much, and thank you for walking us through the paper. I found it really, really insightful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Paula, I'm Basani. You can call me that. Anyone, Louise, your knowledge of some of the government corridor talk?
Yeah, no, I don't have any knowledge of any of the things that Paula was asking about. But I mean, I must say for me, we have to build a movement. You know, I think there's one aspect is like, I think it's a heritage of the anti-apartheid struggle, and we're a bit stuck in it. That we think that, you know, the only action that we got to get into is telling government what it should be doing. And I think that's a dimension of things, but there's also, you know, creating our own agency and telling each other and speaking between grassroots organizations and labor unions and, you know, talking to business. And, you know, government isn't the only audience in the room, and policy isn't the only site of struggle. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I think that is a really wonderful way to close this discussion. I just want to thank everyone on this call, our speakers, each of you. Thank you very much for moving us forward. The road is long, but we'll get there eventually. And just to also thank our wonderful contributors through our participants as well. And yeah, watch the space for more that is to come. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Basani. Bye.
Thank you.
How do I get out of here now? Oh, there, little person leaving. Leave.